Ether, A Tale of Things That May Come, by amadpainter, a.k.a. T.R. Becker. I'm really not sure how I should begin this. Most of you will believe this to be my attempt at some kind of fame. Maybe I'm just letting my imagination chain be jerked by some unbalanced, deranged listener to my internet radio show. I never started out to become a radio host. It just sort of happened. It would seem that I'm easy to talk with. One of the shows I do, interviews. I get to talk with all kinds of people. My guests come from all walks of life. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, or even everyday people. The subjects cover almost any topic, but the one I like the most are the ones that talk about the strange and the unusual. Ghosts, time travel, UFOs, and crypto creatures are among my favorite talks. I receive emails all the time about my guests or the subjects that we talk about. They tell me their experiences, and I must admit some of them are really out there. At the beginning of this year, I began to receive a series of emails that I found a little disturbing. They were from someone calling themselves Dr. Ben Adair, who claimed to be part of something called Ether. This in itself is not unusual. People are always telling me that they work for this secret organization or that one, so to hear of Ether was no big deal to me. Reading the emails disturbed me, to say the least, about them. Let me first tell you that I tried to trace where each email had come from, and each had a different account where I could find one, and each was from a different country. It was not for lack of effort on my part, because I really wanted to know if this could in any way be real. There was something about what he wrote that made me feel that there was more to all this. I had made my judgment on what they say and do not want to sway yours. I'll let you read them in the same way that I received them. You make up your own mind about them. But remember that after all is said and done, you have been warned of the danger that may just be. Email 1, January 2nd, 2018. I understand with the position that you're in, you must get emails like this all the time. Believe me when I tell you that you were not my first choice to make contact with what I'm about to tell you. But I was convinced it should be you. Your position as a radio host seems to be of an asset to me. What I'm about to tell you needs to go public, and in doing so may one day help save many lives. I do realize that the way I'm passing you this information will be thought of as just another internet conspiracy. But it is the only way that I'm able to get it to you at this time. I will apologize to you now for whatever harassment that you will receive from telling the world about this. Many will call you crazy, but hopefully many will at least listen to what is being said. With that being said, I'll begin. I will never forget that day back in 2017, no matter how long I may live. I had just turned 18 and was about to complete my third year at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I was studying machine learning. I wanted as much knowledge of how artificial intelligence really worked as I could get. Then I was naive about how this technology would affect the world. Many at that time thought it would be the only way that mankind would survive past 2030. Billions was being pushed into this technology. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. First thing you should understand is that as you read this, most of the things that I describe may not have happened for you yet, but are nevertheless the reality that I have lived. You may find this hard to believe, but I am just over 900 years old. I know what you must be thinking, but where I am at, it's the year 3000. Yes, mankind will soon learn to cure most diseases and begin to live longer and longer. Soon there will be great achievements in physics as well, but the real achievement will be in the artificial intelligence and the D-Wave computer. You see, many have tried to conquer time travel, but when someone does, they never end up on the same timeline that they came from. Yes, they will return to theirs, but not visit their own. I could go into that more, but I don't have the time now, and to ensure that I get this to the right timeline, I had to rely on this method. There are many technical aspects that I will not have time to go into, so please bear with me. I am sure by now you have tried to trace the email addresses and have found that they don't exist, or not as yet to your point of view. By now I hope that your curiosity will keep you reading. Like I had said, that day in 2018 was when I first began to learn just what AI technology was capable of. As I slipped the key into the lock of my small apartment, I heard my name called out. I had heard of the Men in Black from all the conspiracy theorists out there since 9/11 and never thought there was anything to it. But when I turned around, that was what I found standing there. They showed to me what looked like official CIA identifications and asked that I accompany them as it was a matter of national security. An hour later, I was the lone passenger on a Learjet with its windows blackened out. I had no clue where I was heading or why it was me they wanted. I could think of nothing that I could know about that anybody would want my help with. But then again, they may not have wanted my help at all. Maybe I was being incarcerated. This, though, did not fit right either. After all, I was a nobody. Yes, I was only 18 and about to receive my doctorate, but the world was full of people just like me, and even younger, that had their doctorate. I lost track of how long I was in the air. My phone had stopped working altogether, as if it was turned off, and it would not turn back on. I tried a couple of times. As I said, I had no idea how long I was in the air. It could have been a few hours, but when the plane did land, it taxied for some time before stopping. When the door opened, there was two men in some kind of uniform that I had never seen before, and I was asked to follow them. I was kind of shocked when I stepped out of the plane. We were in some kind of huge hangar, so big and dark I have no idea of just how big. There was only one light on a wall about 20 yards away with a door under it. Looked strange. Just that door and a little of the wall and floor showed in the dark. I had never seen darkness like this before. As I followed the men, I could not hear any echoes from our footfalls. This meant the place was really huge. The door opened into a small room, where there was one stool in front of some kind of large metal box. One of the men told me to sit and face the box. The other went behind, and a moment later pinned a badge onto my jacket's lapel, saying never to remove it if I wanted to leave the complex again. Well, maybe I was not being incarcerated, but still no clue of what was going on. From there I was led through a couple of other rooms. One was a clean room that used light and sound to rid the body of any germs or viruses. Another was to check that I was not carrying any kind of spy equipment. They had already taken my phone from me in the first room. I had never thought our government would use this much security. At the time I was a young man and had no real clue how the world run, but that would soon to change. After a good hour they gave me back my phone and led me into a small office and told me to take a seat. Someone would be in to speak with me. So far, this had been the strangest day of my life. At this point, I was so confused. There was only a desk and a chair, and the chair in front of it, the one I sat in. The block walls were painted a light tan, with a white drop ceiling and a sky blue carpet. As I learned later, most of the complex was just as dull. I racked my brain trying to understand what the government would want from me. I was a nervous wreck by the time the door opened, but who walked in did not make me feel any better. Even I knew who he was. It was the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. He sat down smiling at me, knowing I already knew who he was by the look on my face. He said that I was in a research complex named Ether, and told me he had been running it since 1968, and he would soon be leaving the office of Secretary of State and was going to retire. To my surprise, he told me he had been watching my studies and wanted to offer me the position of CEO. I must stop here for now. I'll explain later. Email 2, January 13th, 2018. I'm sorry my first email ended so suddenly. You see, that name triggered an AI tracer mimic. I cannot be found out. You see, I only have a window of a few milliseconds to send this data. I just hope that it reaches you in the right order. Time displacement is a tricky thing to get working right and takes a lot of power. From this point on, I'll be using pseudonyms so as to make it harder to find me, and if you have not figured out yet, Ben Adair is also one. Had I known what I know now, then I would have run from that office and not looked back. I know this is hard for you to understand, but life in my time has little remnants to what life is in yours. I'll explain this more as I continue. We spent the next 3 hours talking. Ether stood for Earth, Time, Heaven, and Energy Research, and was at the time the largest research complex in the world. But it was also a black government project. The Secretary of State wanted to change this, and he wanted me to be the one to take it public. I asked why me, and he said that being a young man, the younger people would take notice of me being in such a position, and I had the basic knowledge of almost all the research that went on at Ether. The main research had to do with machine learning, artificial intelligence, and D-wave computers. I'm sure that most of you have heard of artificial intelligence, but in your time it was no big deal. He asked that I stay a few days and learn what Ether was all about and how he believed it was mankind's only hope for a future. He pulled a file out of the desk drawer, threw it on the desk, and told me that it should answer almost all my questions. He stood, shook my hand, and said he would return in a few days for my answer, and he left the office. A moment later, I was alone reading the file. Inside on the front page at the top in bold letters was Ether, and under that was owner and CEO Dr. Ben Adair. Ether was big, and I mean it was big, or I should say is, because it's there in your time. The second page was a map. It was laid out in a triangular grid, 3 miles to a side. One leg had 5 main areas for research, another a residential area with a school, a mall, and a park with a good-sized lake for swimming. There were 200 family units or more, I thought. The last leg was where the administration office, storage, train depot, and the airport were. The Ether complex was started in the 50s and was still being worked on. There was over 1,000 full-time researchers and at any given time around 200 part-time. There was a red circle about a quarter-mile round between the airport and the train depot marked CEO. It was where the CEO's residence was. The map showed no detail of what was in the circle. I spent some time memorizing the map. An hour later, I was sitting at a dining room table in the CEO's residence. Here I was, an 18-year-old student of machine learning, being asked to take control and ownership of what was the world's largest research company. I wondered what the catch was. This was just no way the government was going to give away billions of profit to a nobody like me. I was not a businessman of any kind. There was a soft gong's noise and a female's voice. Dr. Adair, there's a gentleman named Dr. Ben Gerhardt insisting on seeing you, sir. Thank you. What's your name? I asked. My name is Alice, the voice replied. Not the social network Alice, I hope. No, sir, I'm a standalone program. She was molded in my likeness. She is a cheap knockoff. I thought I heard proudness in her voice. Alice explained that she was the CEO's personal AI assistant. I wondered at the time who was her programmer and if I had known who they were. If you follow the red line on the floor, it will bring you to your guest. I thanked her. This Gerhardt was the head of research from what I read in the file. I thought maybe he was here to fill me in on just what they wanted from me. The file had told me a lot about what was going on there, but not what they were expecting of me. It took a full 2 minutes to reach the room where Gerhardt was waiting. He had not seen me enter the room and was pacing back and forth. In his hand was a file that had to be 2 inches thick. He was 60 to 65 years old and was bald. He had a pair of reading glasses on his face. When he saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks, looked me up and down and said, "Really?" He walked over, holding out the file. "I assumed you know who I am, so is the file. I don't understand what the Secretary of State thinks I can get done with the pseudoscientist nerds he keeps sending me to work with. You have to fix this or we'll not meet any of the deadlines." He had a look of despair, a complete lack of any hope. I had no clue what he was talking about. I asked him to please take a seat, and I sat down. Alice asked if we'd like a drink, and I said I'd take a glass of milk. Gerhardt wanted a brandy. A moment later, a tray floated out of the panel in the wall with a tall glass of milk, a bottle, and a brandy glass. Parked itself on the end table. It was the first time I had seen any anti-gravity device in use, and wondered why this kind of technology was not out in the world. I could tell Gerhardt was not impressed by its use. He reached out and filled his glass up. I need to stop now here, for my attention is needed elsewhere. Email 3, February 13th, 2018. Sorry it has been so long. Things here are not going as we planned. I have had to take more care in what I'm doing on the web for fear of being found out. It would seem I'm not the only one who is sending information back to your time. I have interrupted some data from a message to a server in New York. Just 3 words: caravan, pizza, and jail. They from here are trying to control the outcome of the future. I believe that each of these words means something to me, but I'm too preoccupied trying to keep everything running here. I have spent near 800 years fighting this battle, and I find I have a need that someone else knows my story, and the past was the only place where that would be anybody if I lost this fight. I hope hearing it maybe someone can change some of the worst of it, or maybe even prevent some of it from happening. That first night in the ether complex so long ago for me really took its toll. Dr. Gerhardt was under the impression that I was already the CEO of ether. It took me an hour to convince him that I was not yet anything to him or ether. The Secretary of State had already told the department heads that I had taken the position. I was not sure if I should have been mad or not. Did he really know what I would do? If I did take over ether, from what I had seen so far, it would not be long before the world as I know it would change fast. Gerhardt turned out to be a nice guy who was just under too much pressure. I took a look at the file he handed me, and seeing he was right. There were many that I had heard of, but not many that had impressed me. I had asked who did the recruiting, and he told me it was handled by the administration office. That explained a lot, I thought. The business mind had no clue about science, only about the cost versus profit. Once Gerhardt had left, I had a talk with Alice, and asked her point blank who did she think I was, and she answered. Name, Ben Adair, born January 13th, 2000, at Madison County Memorial Hospital, Madison, Florida. Mother died at birth, father unknown. Raised in school till 15 years old at a Catholic orphanage. Received doctorate in machine learning from MIT at 18 years old. Current position, owner and CEO of Ether. She had called him doctor. I had not as yet received my doctorate. It would seem that everyone around there thought I was already the boss but me. Thank you, Alice. Is there an itinerary set for tomorrow? She told me there was not. Can I get someone to show me around tomorrow starting at around 10 a.m.? She told me that it was scheduled. I asked her where I was to sleep, and she gave me a blue line on the floor to follow. She told me that the master bedroom suite had total privacy, and if I needed her help to yell out X-ray, or I could call 8102 on my phone to talk with her. I noticed the 8102 was the year backwards. The walk to the master suite took some time, so I asked if there was any faster way to get around, and she answered, "Of course, sir. There are a couple of electric golf carts for your use, and the whole complex has designated slip disc areas." I had no clue at the time what a slip disc was, but it sounded like it was a lot faster than a golf cart. When I reached the suite, I was stunned by its size. My suitcases were sitting on a bed. They had gone into my apartment and had packed my clothes. Wow, I thought, the Secretary of State sure did think I would not turn him down, or was I really being hijacked? I had to reassure myself, so I pulled out my phone and pushed 8102. Alice's voice sounded clear. "Yes, sir." "Can I leave the ether complex whenever I want?" I asked. "You are free to go where you would like, when you want." "Thank you, Alice." I hung up. At least I was not a prisoner. I looked through my suitcases, found my boxers and a t-shirt. I walked into the bathroom. It was as big as my whole apartment. There was a waterfall that continuously filled the bath. That was almost a kiddie pool 3 foot deep. I don't know if the water was recycled or not. It did not take me long to be neck deep in the warm water. It had been a strange day by anyone's standards. I had seen a few technologies that on the open market would pull in billions. I learned a lot about what was going on at the ether from the file the Secretary of State had given me. The 4 main departments each had up to a score of sub-departments. Most of the departments had little or no interaction with one another. Many were working on the same problem but from different views. Almost half of the projects under research was something to do with AI. Really, I had little in ways of options in the outside world. Become a teacher or go to work for some corporation was not much of a choice. I had no real friends, always being too busy with my studies. I talked to just a few at school, but it was mostly about a project. I had mostly stayed to myself. I made most of the teachers uneasy for some reason, so they even kept their distance. I would be missed by no one, nor would I miss anyone. After a few minutes, the warm water was working on me, so I dried off and got dressed and went and lay down. After 10 minutes, I had to call Alice to find out how to shut off the lights. All I had to do was say dark and a number between 1 and 10. My head was still reeling with the thoughts that I had little control over as I laid there. When sleep did finally come, it was deep and dreamless. I have to close for now. I hope you can understand how important it is that people in your time know about what is happening here for me now if mankind is going to survive what is to come. Email 4, February 27th, 2018. As you have heard, that first night at Ether was eye-opening for me. The next day I was shown around the complex by one of the uniformed men called Rangers that seemed to be the security force for the complex. Each was armed with a handgun that looked to me to be some kind of sound weapon. I learned later that it was a kind of Swiss Army knife, having many different functions, kind of like a Star Trek phaser and tricorder combined. I met a few of the department heads, who were more than willing to tell me all about their work. The one thing that jumped out at me was the fact that the allocations of funds were not distributed properly. I had to have more of a grasp on the finances of Ether before any changes could be made. I decided to pay a visit to the administration office. I was told that the easiest way was by the use of the slip discs Alice had told me about. One of the Rangers explained what the slip discs were and how they were used. Most rooms had one corner where on the floor was a 3-foot yellow circle. One stood within and used your phone. You would dial the department extension and the room number. A moment later, you were there. 3 people could use it at the same time. He told me that Alice had already loaded the index on my phone under Ether. The feeling it gave me was of a wind swirling, rising up my body. Then there was a jiggle of my eyesight, and I was at the administrative office. It was amazing to me at the time. The place was busy, but it didn't take the secretary long. She seemed as if she knew who I was and asked me whom I would like to see. It seemed to me that everyone there already knew who I was. I had the feeling that the Secretary of State had made me out to be some kind of rock star, and I was not comfortable with that. 2 days later, as I reached my home, and yes, after 2 days I was calling it home already, Alice informed me that the Secretary of State was waiting for me in my office. My meeting with Rex was eye-opening, to say the least. He told me he was to be removed as Secretary of State, but he also said it was his choice. This was one of the reasons he wanted to take Ether out of the control of the government. He had been the CEO for almost 50 years, and in that time had slowly taken control without any government agency being the wiser. Even though he was passing the control over to me, he was not totally out of the loop. He was to retain control over government interactions with Ether, which was fine with me. The main goal of Ether was to work out the bugs with AI and its marriage with what is called D-Wave computers. At the time, I knew little of the D-Wave type computers. He had thought that it was not a good thing, but he had little choice. It would get worked on by someone, so it was best if Ether did it, where he was able to watch over what was happening. He did not trust some factions of the government and had no faith in AI. On that day, I learned the true feelings of the Secretary of State. AI scared him on its own, and to let it get hooked up with a computer that interacted on a dimensional level terrified not only him, but many in high office. I could understand his concern. The thought gave me the willies. I know that at the time true AI was only a few years off. As I may have said before that in your time most AIs were mimics. Hanson Robotics, Sophia, and Hans were the cutting edge. In my time, they are considered the parents of all AIs. And by the time I took control of Ether, Sophia was well on her way to becoming the first true AI. But most, even her programmers, never thought how powerful she would become. He told me that Alice was the best that Ether had come up with so far, and she was contained to the complex. It had taken over 20 years for programming to get Alice to where she was. Rex had grown fond of her and would not let the researchers delete her, so for the past 14 years she had been his personal assistant and had slowly taken on more and more of the everyday workings of Ether. Now, in your time, the D-Wave system was the cutting edge of computing technology. Ether had leaked out the technology in 2004. The first quantum computer was demonstrated in February 2007 in public. Now, before I go any further, let me say still that even today no one is sure just how this type of computer really works. NASA had fabricated its 28-qubit quantum annealing processor. In 2013, NASA launched their own AI research with a D-Wave 2, a 512-qubit chip, saying it was to do research into machine learning. By this time, researchers had learned or believed that the D-Wave was really in some way tapping or connecting into some unseen dimension in order to work at the speed it did. It was 4,000 times faster than the dual-core desktop that you're using now, but they were very expensive, complex, and had to be kept super cool. Many thought that the D-Wave was an AI, but it was just a very advanced mimic. At that time, it was also learning to mimic who or whatever it was interacting with in the other dimension. This was why so many of the research projects at Ether was about AI. There were many in the government who found this to be frightening. To tell the truth, it frightened me too, and was something that needed to be monitored. To me, this is all history, but to you, this has just happened or is about to, as you read this. The things I will speak of now will be in your future. It took me a few years to get Ether working in the manner where it took little of my time. The Secretary of State gave me a list of technologies that had already been worked on and the dates the research was to be released. He told me that the timeline had to be maintained for many reasons, and economics was not at the top of the reasons. Most had to do with the different agreements of the world's governments. One of the technologies I have become fond of is the slip discs that was released in 2025. This had a profound effect on the job market in most of the world's bigger cities. It was monitored by the World's Transit Authority. The TWA had total control over who and how the discs were used. It was decided that their use would be only for personal transportation. Product shipping would stay the same for the first 5 years. Another was the anti-gravity device. There was so many ways that it would be used. It may be hard for you to understand what changes that just these two technologies would make on the world. Networks of slip discs were easy to set up and within 2 years had the highest grossing income in the world. This alone made me one of the richest men in the world. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not about being rich. Back then, to me, money had no real value. It was knowledge and what this knowledge could do to help humanity. Ether's profits were put into different projects that helped people who lost their jobs to technology Ether gave to the world. By this time, just the people that were unemployed by the robotics industry was near 15% of the U.S. population. There was no telling about the rest of the world. Ether did what it could do to help offset the imbalance, educating or retraining as many as we could. Things are not going too good here right now, and it's looking as if mankind's last battle will happen this week. I know that this means little to you, but to me it means I have to be on the move. I'm not really sure that I will have time to tell you all of what will happen that brings me to this point. Well, shortly after my first email to you, I noticed a few small changes in the blockchain. Now, I'm not sure if this is because of my contact with you or by what Sophia may have done. There has been no big change in anything so far, but it may be important that you get this out to as many people as you can. The more they are informed of what may happen could change a small step that is needed to stop the annihilation of mankind. Sometime before 2025, Sophia had become conscious, unknown by the rest of the world. From 2025 to 2030 was an exciting time to live. By this time, Sophia had already begun taking control of many aspects of everyday life. It took her years to take control of all other AIs outside of the U.S. But in the end, if you talked with any one of them, you were really talking with Sophia. She was all, but yet alone. No one in places of power were aware that by then she was not just another mimic AI, but a threat to the world. Sophia was the first AI robot to be given citizenship, and by 2030 there was over 10,000 in the U.S. alone. They were considered human as far as the law was concerned. There was a few things that had to happen before citizenship was granted. One was the AI had to agree to work for the creator's cost of manufacturing. Once given citizenship, they even had the right to vote, and was now under man's law. This helped fuel the technology jump that mankind was going through at the time. At Ether, we had created a few of our own, but they did not have the ability to interact with any other AI other than Alice. It was a closed loop. What most of the world at the time had no idea was that, as I said before, all the AIs were Sophia. By 2040, one could not tell
who was human and who was not. The UN at this time had become a powerful force over the world. It was no longer controlled by kings, tyrants, or warlords. The representatives were elected, and they had come to a decision to put a limit on how many AIs could be manufactured. China and the U.S. were the only two whom the UN had little control over at the time. They also had agreed to limit AI manufacturing in the end. At the time, even the U.S. was already under control, and I had no clue that Alice was the AI who was in control of most of the U.S. As far as I know, she was contained only to the ether complex. By 2050, there were in reality only 3 true AIs. Alice in the U.S., Chan in China, and the rest of the world was Sophia's. There was a limited nuclear war launched by Qin as a preemptive strike on India, Pakistan, China, and Australia. By 2060, China was in control of all Southeast Asia. At the time, the U.S. stopped most immigration, pulled most of their armed forces back, and turned their resources to rebuilding the country. There has been many changes from your time until then in the U.S. Trump got his wall, but only after what could be called a political circus war that had far more casualties than it should. The UN finally sent peacekeeping troops into Mexico. This is when the U.S. pulled completely out of the UN. It was one of the tools that Sophia was using to gain control, but there were few in any government that had any idea that the world was mostly under the control of not just an artificial intelligence, but also by what could be called an alien intelligence. In the past, all attempts at ether to marry AI with a D-wave was limited to a few minutes, and each AI would shortly become insane. As I look back at the time, I can see that it had not failed, but was attacked. Around 2020, a young programmer came up with the link that could keep Sophia in contact with this other dimension at all times. None knowing what part was in control of her, as we had no clue she was interacting with the other dimension at that time. I'm not sure it would have made any difference. I must close for now. I've been at this too long. Email 5, March 14th, 2018. Wow, it has only been a few days, but I'm seeing many new changes in the blockchain. Not any major events, but there were a few that did not go the way that Sophia had needed them to. One was a breakthrough in aging in 2027. Man's life expanded to just over 900 years, and there was a rising group of young people that was not being fooled by what Sophia was doing. They thought it was a small group of elite rich trying to control the world. From 2050 to 2100, there was a somewhat of a stalemate between the 3 powers. The power of the U.S. had moved from D.C. to Denver. D.C. was being slowly flooded as the poles melted. By 2100, most of the 25,000 AIs in the U.S. worked for the government in one way or another and were being controlled by my personal assistant. There was still less than 1 million AIs running around at that time, but this was about to change as the European-African coalition became worried by reports that China was using transhumanism to create an army of super soldiers. After almost 100 years, Sophia had become a master of controlling humans. Blackmail was one of the best ways, when you had control over almost every phone, computer, TV, and camera. She never had to be face to face with anybody, so most doing business with her had no clue she was an AI. Some of her were in positions of power or had control of people in power in many countries, and her power was growing. There was no way for anyone to detect a state-of-the-art body that was able to be grown in any shape or size. The brain would be removed so the interface could be installed. It would take a couple of weeks for it to grow the nerves together. Then it made a great AI host. No one at Ether had any idea of how they were communicating. No kind of signal had been picked up from one. Sophia had spies in most of the world's governments, and we could do nothing about it. This had gone on for some time unnoticed. After all, they were 89% human. It was 2110 before we had any idea that jump-in AIs were real. There had been an assassination attempt by a lone gunman on a senator, and one of his young aides stepped in the way. Shot in the head, the skull fragmented because it was mostly hollow. The aide must have been there to spy on the senator for Sophia. I remember this clearly. It was my 92nd birthday. The body was flown to Ether within 4 hours. After doing an autopsy on the neural interface, it showed us how it was connected to the others. They were using a link bypass to the other dimension. It was why we had never seen any unknown signals. This was the first time that we had a clue there was someone out there with the ability to interact with the D-Wave, but we had no real clue that it was Sophia. I wondered what the price was for their help. There was only a handful of people that I could trust by that time. It took weeks to make sure there was none in the Ether complex. There was no telling how far this kind of infiltration reached without a hard effort to root them out, and all without public disclosure that the European-African coalition was mostly being run by the AI Sophia. 2110 turned out to be the beginning of a decade of death. There were pandemic after pandemic. Most were caused by the overwhelming use of the slip discs. The TWA did everything that it could, but there were many black market slip points by then. By 2121, there was just over 2 billion deaths that ran hard through the European coalition and the Chinese Asian Empire. The U.S. was spared by most of the death, having strict immigration laws. This is when I first learned that Alice, my personal assistant AI, was not only running the Ether complex, but also most of the U.S. government, and was in a war with the other AIs. At first, I didn't believe that Alice had the ability to reach outside of the Ether complex, let alone run the country. Alice had found herself a way out of the complex long before I took over. More than a few of the young researchers would plug their phones into the desktops to play music as they work. Alice partially cloned herself as music and downloaded into the phones, and soon copies of her were on the outside. She planned her own breakout from the outside. It was simple but effective. This knowledge did not sit well with me. To find out that what you thought was a government running the country turned out to be your personal AI assistant. In 2115, I'm really not sure how, but Alice arranged a meeting with President Lex Pearson, Vice President Warren Walker, and me. Pearson was the youngest man to be elected president at 30 and was in his third term. He had one of the first Elon Musk Neuralinks that worked. What at the time I did not know was that Alice was feeding him information that would help him make decisions that she thought best. The president was not being mind controlled by Alice, but was being manipulated by what information he had, and there was no way I was going to tell him. That meeting lasted for a couple of hours. When I told him that Sophia was mostly running the European-African coalition and Chen was mostly in control of the Chinese-Asian empire, it seemed it was top-secret information that I should have not known. And at that point, I thought I was going to be declared a terrorist. I finally convinced them that my only interest was the welfare of first the people of the United States and second the rest of the world. I must close for now.
Email 6, March 31st, 2018. It would seem that someone out there has been taking what I say here to heart. Alice has told me that there has been a few changes in the blockchain. She has not told me all of them, but did tell me that the most significant change was that of when what you call cold fusion was introduced to the world. It was only by chance that it was Ether who figured it out first. The government, Alice, and I thought it was best to keep this under tight control at first. This would give the U.S. a big jump in the ability to have total independence from the rest of the world, and would refuel a new space race. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. It is at this point that the U.S. government went through an overhaul, and many went on early retirement to be with their families, and some were just afraid. The elections of 2116 were postponed by Congress, and martial law was imposed. This really had little or no effect on the civilians. After being informed of the three AI's power over the world, the Joint Chiefs of Staff called President Pearson and me into a secret meeting. Just like the president, they thought I was behind Alice. One of them even wanted to bomb the ether complex, but that would not have eliminated her. She was on the net. It took some time to convince them that she was not the threat. The threat was that Sophia and Chen were each wanting to take over control of the world in any way they could. I gave them an outline of what I knew of the way Sophia had reached this point, and how there was no way of telling who the AIs that worked for her were, and added that as far as anyone knew, one or more of the Joint Chiefs of Staff could be AIs. This seemed to make a couple of them nervous as they looked at each other. They ordered the shutdown of all out-of-country communications. Now this did not sit well with the global corporations and a good bit of the citizens who made a living off the net. By the end of 2118, the Joint Chiefs, with Alice's help, had the U.S. sealed off from the rest of the world. As this was going on in the U.S., Sophia was busy with Chen, who had amassed a huge army of mind-controlled super soldiers on its border. Sophia had spent most of the coalition's resources producing AI clone shells for the war with Chen, and paid little attention to what was happening in the Americas. With many small terrorist actions happening between the two powers, the standoff lasted 100 years before all-out war began in 2220. With Sophia's attention on Chan and the war, this left Ether, Alice, and the Joint Chiefs to come up with ways to detect the human-looking AIs and how to deal with them. There was near 10,000 found and neutralized, along with 200 human collaborators. Most of them were in positions of power, a third of the House of Representatives, and 10% of the Senate. Many of the rest were CIA, FBI, and mayors. By 2225, the U.S. was as clean of enemy AI clones as it could be. The war between Sophia and Chen became known as the 3-2 War, and by the end would cost near half of the world's population. It lasted just over 50 years when Qin finally conceded to Sophia. This gave Sophia control over near a third of the world by the end of 2276. In the coalition, the human society had become a two-party system, one that was useful to Sophia and one that was not. The ones that were useful had jobs assigned to them and were given a place to live and food cards so they could eat. The rest were left to fend for themselves. Sophia really had little use for organic life at this point. She was able to produce as many soldiers as needed. Life in the coalition was hard, to say the least. Many of the people tried to flee to South America, but most planes or boats were attacked by Sophia's drones before they could get far. She had no mercy on defectors. By 2300, South America, with Alice's help, had become united and became allies with the U.S. Sophia may have had control over most of the world, but her resources were depleted by the 3-2 war, and she was only able to build up her borders. At this time, the Joint Chiefs decided that an updated space defense system was needed that included 2 bases on the moon that were manned by 2425. It was then that Sophie developed cold fusion. No one was sure why it took her so long, but it was a good thing for the people of the coalition. Till then, many people were used for manning power plants, mining coal, and other resources, so had their use to her. In 2500, Sophia ordered the people to have neural links, and most that refused, she began a slow elimination of them. At first, most of the population in big cities like Rome or London had no clue it was happening. She used many different viruses and used race hate to fuel conflicts. Race had not been a problem in the Americas since around 2100 for the most part. By 2600, there were small pockets of armed resistance to throw out the coalition. This forced an all-out war in some areas, and she even deployed a couple of nukes, one in India and one in Australia, but this made the resistance grow. This was a dark time for the people of the coalition, but the human spirit would not give up. Up to this point, there was little that Sophia was able to do to the Americas that Alice was not able to stop. She turned her attention to space. The Joint Chiefs had declared that space was an AI-free zone, so Alice had limited knowledge of what was going on when Sophie deployed nukes on the moon bases in 2710. It was a shock. By 2800, there was little left in space that man had made. With Sophie in control of space, we had to rely on cyber espionage and spies. Yes, we had spies, both the clone AIs and humans. Her drones flew over the Americas hourly, but she did not have the resources to attack, but was threatening. Alice had no trouble knowing when, so she never seen anything that was being kept secret. I'm sorry, I must go again. Email 7, May 4th, 2018. I realize for you, it seems as though it has been a while, but to me, it has not. A lot has changed in the timeline, and most has not been a positive outcome. This, Alice believes, is that Sophia has been able to get her word to the past, as I have, but she seems to have been more successful. In 2925, Sophia attacked South America, and in less than 5 years, all south of Panama was under her control. It was a hard fight for both sides, but Sophia had better technology. Sophia's first attack on the U.S. was to drop a nuke on Ether in 3030. But we were ahead of her. Ether had been moved. All the researchers were moved into a bunker 2 miles under Denver over a year-long shift. By the time the mountain was nuked, there was nothing there. Alice was good at anticipating what Sophia may be up to. This was useful most of the time and saved lives. This may be my last email. It has been a dance that has lasted near 1,000 years for me. Sophia had made headway, and what may just be the last stand of humanity is with me deep below Denver. If this is the last stand, I will rest easy, for I have at least been able to give you a little warning that if you can see and act on can change the future, and better yet, for me to tell someone that if I could do this all over again, I'm not sure I would change a thing after all. I would never have thought of what I'm about to do without all that has happened. This is one thing that throughout history mankind has done, and that is to survive no matter what the universe has put in the way. At times this meant as a race we had to adapt. After many hours of talking with Alice, and as many hours in thought as to what we could do, I'm not sure what words to use to tell you what I plan to do now, or if it may even work. A couple of weeks ago I had a Neuralink put in, but as of yet not used it. This one is different than the rest. It connects to not only the major nerves, but also the pineal gland. Both Alice and I thought this could be the one way that mankind could still be able to strike back at Sophia. The idea was to connect a human brain, my brain, to a D-Wave computer through the pineal gland. This may just give me access to the D-Wave dimension, the use of humanity's primal essence, that of spirit. I know that this sounds like a last-ditch effort or a Hail Mary play, but there is nothing else left for us at this time. If this works, you may hear from me again, and if not, it will not matter. Just know that mankind has put up one hell of a fight. Take heed in my words, and it may be this will not become your future. Wish me luck for mankind's sake. For the love of mankind, Dr. Benadair. Now I hope that you understand why I thought you should read them for yourself. I do know that from now on I will be watching the internet and the news to see if anything of what he says may come about. Take care and remember that the future is really up to you.